Good afternoon, everybody. This is Jeff J. Brown, China Rising Radio Sinoland, and I've got a wonderful program in written form, audio, and video for you today. It is Joan Roelofs' interview, and she is searching for what is the good life, how it can be attained for all. That includes you and me. And who has the power to prevent or make it happen. Pictured above, left Joan Roelofs and write her book, Foundations in Public Policy, The Mask of Pluralism. Here we go. I'm truly honored to have Dr. Joan Roelofs on the show today. Our discussion will revolve around some of her publications. I'd like to thank our mutual friend, Dr. T.P. Wilkinson, for putting us in touch. First, a little bit about Joan. Joan Roelofs is a semi-retired political science professor and author of a few books and many articles in scholarly journals and online news magazines. She has been an activist in green and peace organizations and lives in Keene, New Hampshire in the USA. I have listed for you here her website where she does all of her journalism. And she is also listed where you can buy her 4 books, and you'll be hearing more about each one of these as we go through the interview. The World War of Small Pastries, and the next one is Victor considérant principe du socialisme, manifeste de la démocratie au XIXe siècle. So this was a translation into English, so don't worry, you don't have to speak French. Victor Considérant's well-known book from the 19th century. And then Foundations in Public Policy, The Mask of Pluralism, which I pictured above. And then Greening, Greening, Cities. On social media, you can find her, and I will spell her name. It's Joan, J-O-A-N, and then Roelofs, R-O-E-L-O-F-S. You can find her on Facebook, LinkedIn, and academia.edu. Joan and I have been communicating for several months via email, and it's hard not to be impressed with her intellect, wit, and friendliness. Her experience and productivity put me to shame. Joan's CV makes mine look like a short order cook's recipe for French fries. She is from my parents' generation. Thus, for me, people like her who are still giving it the good fight for a better world, a more inhabitable planet, and socioeconomic justice for the global 99% are very special indeed. I learned and appreciated much reading Joan's articles and monographs to prepare for our conversation. When finished, I'm sure you will agree with me that all of her students were very lucky to have Joan as a teacher and a lecturer. Without further ado, enjoy a great written interview, which I'm happy to podcast for China Rising Radio Sinoland's audio-visual fans. Here we go. Jeff J. Brown's question number 1. Joan, please tell us about yourself growing up and your arc of awareness about Western Empire, socialism, to the point that it inspired you to be a journalist and author. Dr. Joan Roelofs, answer number 1. There were several socialists in my family, including my maternal grandmother and various relatives. My parents were New Deal Democrats. My early political awareness was inspired by attending Camp Woodland in Phoenicia, New York, a left-wing interracial summer camp, reading Edward Bellamy's Looking Backward, and a high school class called Problems of Democracy. That required us to travel in groups without our teacher throughout New York City to participate in fora and debates. Their content was, quote, progressive, but not especially socialist. It was the McCarthy era. When I began college at Cornell, I was a chemistry major, but also on the debate team. My history courses introduced me to Fourier and other socialist thinkers. I changed my major to political science and transferred to Barnard College for personal reasons. I did not plan my life rationally. Somewhat accidentally, I obtained a teaching fellowship and PhD in political science from New York University. My political views were based on my own research and values and had been tolerated or mocked by my professors. As a political scientist, I have two broad approaches. One, the ancient one. What is the good life and how can it be attained for all? Two, who and what institutions have political power? The ability to make or prevent change. For a college professor, writing and research is part of the job. I had always enjoyed public speaking, writing, and teaching, so becoming a professor was a reasonable place to land. For intellectual stimulation, I published, presented at conferences and as a guest speaker, and served as an editor of two journals, Telos or Telos, Telos, and Capitalism, Nature, Socialism. Before I retired from full-time teaching as a full professor, I had two books published, one, Greening Cities and Foundations and Public Policy. When I retired, I wanted to reach a wider, more activist audience, so I wrote short journalistic articles, especially for Counterpunch. However, I also freely indulged my Fourieriste, French or English, take your pick, Fourieriste interests, translating Victor Considerant's Socialist Manifesto, and with a co-author translating an episode from Fourier's writing, World War of Small Pastries, an anti-war parody. During the last 15 years, I have been mostly concerned with the political power of the military-industrial complex, especially the embrasure of the embrasure of the nonprofit sector in its arms. Sorry, sometimes I get my French and my English mixed up. Jeff's question number 2. What is your book Greening Cities about? Joan's answer number 2. Many of my publications were inspired by the courses I taught. Among those I taught annually at KSC was local public administration. The textbooks available lacked a green perspective, so when I had a year-long sabbatical, I decided to write a green textbook, which incidentally required me to travel. At first, I thought it would be mostly games and simulations. My students had loved and learned from Nicholas Henry's book called Doing Public Administration. But Professor Henry had moved on and had no time to update it. He encouraged me to attempt at something similar. At the time, I was an active member of the Green Movement in the U.S. We had a local group called the Monadnock Greens. I called it a functional disfamily. That was productive and supportive. Like many activists of the 1980s and 90s, we were influenced by the affinity group style of the Clamshell Alliance. At the national level, I was elected to the Coordinating Council of the Greens/Green Party USA, serving from 1992 to 1993. My concept of green was based on the Green Movement's values, social justice, as well as environmental concerns. While the book does include simulations and student exercises for each chapter, it mostly describes aspects of a sustainable and just community and examples of projects undertaken throughout the world by governments and non-governmental organizations that have further green values. During my travels, I spent most time in Australia and also investigated developments in the U.S., Canada, and Europe. Greening Cities was much more successful than I had anticipated. It was used in an architecture college in Australia by the European Commission on Sustainable Towns and Cities, and in the Environmental Studies program at Middlebury College, which granted me a medal in 2000. To my surprise, I discovered it in an installation by Nils, N-I-L-S, Norman at the Massachusetts Museum of Contemporary Art. Jeff's question number 3. In your 1995 monthly review article entitled "The Third Sector as a Protective Layer for Capitalism," it was awe-inspiring to see what 99% of the global citizenry would take as a good concept, foundations and non-governmental organizations, NGOs, but that, like the global media and many governmental entities, has been hijacked by the deep state, which includes the military-industrial complex, abbreviated MID, Wall Street/London, the CIA/MI6 complex for starters. You mentioned a figure of $400 billion just in the USA alone. That's dollars. It is not new. Christian foundations and NGOs were all over China in the 19th and 20th centuries, trying to save yellow souls, and still are, in the form of above and below ground churches. What was really fascinating is your analysis that these foundations are incestuous, with interlinking funding, NGOs, corporations, media, political parties, governments, investments, churches, private universities, schools, museums, zoos, teaching hospitals, conservation trusts, opera houses, and all their directors, boards, client targets, and outcomes. It is a cozy club indeed. You wrote that real ecological socialist movements get buried while the aforementioned steamroller whitewashes all of global capitalism's poverty, militarism, racism, and environmental damage. It is really hard for well-intentioned, high-ideal, but money-desperate groups to not get compromised, infiltrated by imperial global capitalist interests, and eventually suborned. The Black Panther Party, the BPP, produced its own national newspaper to pay for its self-reliance, people serving socialist programs. In the 1930s, the Rockefellers reached out to Mao Zedong and the Communist Party of China / People's Liberation Army, the CPC/PLA, and supposedly advanced them money with the hopes of co-opting them. But the Chinese communists were very successful in their self-sufficiency Soviets to grow, produce, and manufacture all their needs, even high-tech items. I just interviewed USA political prisoner of conscience Mumia Abu-Jamal. His recommendation to Black Lives Matter, BLM, is intense historical study of how noble causes get infiltrated and sabotaged, as well as citing the BPP with their self-financing as a model to look to. It seems like the global capitalist oligarchy has the foundation-NGO sector totally sewn up towards their dystopian plans. What are we communists, socialists, and anti-imperialists to do? Sell newspaper subscriptions and carve out Chinese Soviets in the hinterlands? Is communist socialist revolution, like in the USSR, China, DPRK, Vietnam, Cuba, and Eritrea, one of the only ways, or another ideological socialist revolution, like Iran's Islamic Revolution? When you look at what happens in socialist democracies like Venezuela, Angola, Cambodia, and many others, with the Western deep state crushing them 24/7 and often overthrowing them, is there a third or fourth way for lasting social and economic justice for the global 99%? Joan's answer to number 3. Foundations were not hijacked by the deep state, they were co-conspirators. Like the other elements of the progressive movement in the early 20th century, the creators of the Carnegie, Rockefeller, Sage, and other foundations took seriously many criticisms of the quote, free enterprise, end of quote, system made by the increasingly threatening socialist movements. They wanted to clean up capitalism, to preclude its demise by socialism. Some were genuinely disturbed by the murder and mayhem of unfettered laissez-faire. Thus, they were servitors of the Cold War, which I say began in 1848, the year of the Communist Manifesto, and hasn't ended. The capitalists took Marx very seriously and worked to make sure his were self-denying prophecies. In the mid-20th century, when the Ford Foundation became national in scope, it was the soft cop of U.S. imperialism. Kai Bird's biography states, and that's Kai, K-A-I, and then Bird as the animal. Kai Bird's biography states, John J. McCloy, for many years chairman of the Ford Foundation's trustees, thought of the foundation as a quasi-extension of the U.S. government. It was his habit, for instance, to drop by the National Security Council in Washington every couple of months and casually ask whether there were any overseas projects the NSC would like to see funded. That's from his book called John J. McCloy and the Making of the American Establishment. Continuing on, the Rockefeller Foundation, predecessor of the United Nations World Health Organization, among other institutions, supported medical education worldwide, including in China, which facilitated a globalized economy. A major theme in my book, Foundations in Public Policy, is evidence that the large liberal foundations channeled and co-opted the activist movements of the 60s and 70s. For research and humanitarian motives, I became a member of the Haymarket People's Fund Board, a radical foundation, and the book includes information on its impact. The foundations and the co-opted nonprofit sector not only prevented radical change, they, along with governments, often provided the rudiments of civilization that free enterprise neglects, although most of the world remains unjust, environmentally destructive, and subject to nuclear annihilation. I don't have very hopeful hints on how to change the world. I believe the first step is for those concerned with the sorry state of things, take some time to work together to figure out how to produce change in the light of history and the current circumstances, and some detail about desired outcomes. There is too much individualism among the communards. Jeff's question number 4. Your Counterpunch article entitled The Political Economy of the Weapons Industry reminds me of a great documentary movie that came out in the early 2000s, and I can't remember the title, unfortunately, something like War Inc. or anyway. But that was actually a different movie. Capitalism is based on war, which Marx and Lenin wrote about. Capitalism and war are a tautology. You write how the military-industrial complex, the MIC, should add the word legislative to its name, like parting U.S. President Dwight Eisenhower warned about and who gave us the moniker. Just like the deep state co-opting foundations and NGOs, the MIC corrupts all the aforementioned institutions, charities, governments at all levels, as well as the sports, entertainment, and prison industries. In my interview with John Potash, he reported that the U.S. Department of Defense is the publisher of 1,200 magazine titles around the world. This, not to mention putting some kind of military institution or program in every congressional district in the USA. It's no better in France, where the military facilities and armaments factories are spread all over the country. We just had a platoon of soldiers come to our village to spend the weekend, and their money handing out promotions, awards, and filling up all the restaurants and souvenir shops. Who's going to protest against that? You paint a pretty grim picture of resignation and hopelessness. The MIC is embedded in Western economies like the sand in concrete. What to do? Seems to me that as long as there is global capitalism, there isn't much we can do. It really gets my goat, all these many anti-war organizations who do not see or refuse to see that capitalism and militarism are co-joined twins. Environmental groups rarely mention that the world's biggest polluter is the U.S. military and by extension NATO. Joan's answer number 5. I have tried to reach the peacemongers, urging them to consider what we are up against. It is not merely the weapons makers seeking huge profits. The military budget is a huge prop of the economy. See an article that I wrote called Military Keynesianism Marches On. It underpinned the industrialization of the South, and it mitigates the corrosion of the Rust Belt, which has accelerated with the offshoring of civilian manufacturing. In one of my articles, the military-industrial complex in New Hampshire, on her website, readers of specialty publications such as NH Business Review, New Hampshire Business Review, may learn that in New Hampshire, the F-35 program supports 55 suppliers, 35 of which are small businesses, and over 900 direct jobs, much of them located at BAE Systems in Nashua, Nashua. That's a town in New Hampshire. I've been there. The F-35 program generates over $481 million in economic impact in the state. Incidentally, this aircraft, considered the most expensive weapon in history, has been rated unfavorably by military experts. It doesn't even fly. I'm continuing on with Joan's answer. The city of Nashua's website informs us that BAE is the largest employer in the city, and in addition, quote, a total of 130 defense contractors were awarded contracts between 2000 and 2012, which is indicative of how robust the defense industry has become in Nashua. Not coincidentally, Nashua has been rated the #1 place to live by Money Magazine. Joan continues on. Enormous defense contracts are awarded to information technology firms, intelligence specialists, universities, think tanks, construction companies, logistics, food, clothing, furniture, transportation, janitorial, and security guard firms, as well as many progressive organizations, including environmental NGOs, such as the Nature Conservancy and Ducks Unlimited. Building, maintaining, and upgrading military bases in the U.S. and worldwide is a major item in the budget and an economic stimulus to communities. Philanthropy and investment funds are other ways that military profits shower the population into silence about worldwide carnage and subversion. In fact, my home state, Oklahoma, has Tinker Air Force Base and Fort, I forgot, in Lawton, Oklahoma, two of the biggest Air Force bases in south central United States. Jeff's question number 6. How far back does the USA's martial culture go? 1607 with Jamestown, 1775 in the U.S. War for Independence, or 1898 in the country's great leap into global imperialism? Or do we go all the way back to the non-stop wars of ancient Greece and Rome? Joan's answer number 6. Military values permeate our culture, and our violent history is celebrated in town square monuments, parades, and school curricula. The overflow of military into civilian life began with the new nation. Army Corps of Engineers were charged with mapping, building lighthouses, piers, and post offices, and more recently, flood control and recreational sites. It may be a good way to get things done, but a civilian Department of Public Works, perhaps even with a draft, would not be partnered with the destructive side of the military. Science has long been promoted by the military with its interest in physics for propulsion of weapons, nuclear weapons et al. chemistry for explosives, transportation, communications, and medicine for protection against disease, the greatest killer of troops before the 20th century. Many advances in science and technology had military origins, for example, canned food and the internet. A vast amount of research is funded by the Department of Defense and performed by its employed scientists or through contracts with universities and laboratories in the U.S. and throughout the world. The Special Operations Command sees future wars in a, quote, gray zone, end of quote, of intense political, economic, informational, and military competition, with operation often of a covert and clandestine nature. This has led to a broad array of scientists and other specialists in the military arsenal, social scientists, biologists, gamers, philosophers, even clergy. Glory, hallelujah. Jeff's question number 7. What do you mean by, quote, national, state, and local governments are well covered by this, quote, insecurity blanket, end of quote. And then you had another one where you said so many potential peace activists are smothered into silence under the vast insecurity blanket. What does that mean? Insecurity blanket. Joan's answer number 7. The military's unbeatable weapon is jobs, and all members of Congress and state and local officials are aware of this. It is where good jobs are found for mechanics, scientists, and engineers. Even janitorial workers do well in these taxpayer-rich firms. Construction firms, IT, logistics, and every kind of business, example, child care centers, motels, and landscapers, are also beneficiaries of the military budget. Weaponry is a major part of our manufactured goods exports. Our allies are required to have equipment that meets our specifications. Governments, rebels, terrorists, pirates, and gangsters all fancy our high-tech and low-tech lethal devices. Rarely do leaders, boards, or staffs of civil rights, identity politics, art, music, environmental, poor people's health, or youth organizations, museums, and charities mention militarism as a concern. There is little protest from political activists about the omission of militarism in national candidates, debates, and, quote, campaigns, itself a military term. Unlikely organizations such as the Nature Conservancy or Ducks Unlimited receive significant DoD, Department of Defense for you, and if you're not an American. Others, such as the Congressional Black Caucus or American Association of University Women, receive substantial donations from military contractors. Non-governmental organizations, boards often include retired or current military and national security personnel or executives of weapon firms. Technical assistance to nonprofit groups, example, quote, strategic planning, end of quote, is provided by firms such as Empower, Success Corps, EMPOWER. Success Corps, among its consultants are weapons contractor executives. Peace organizations have used these services. Museums present shows sponsored by military industries and invest in their stocks. Universities also have huge contracts and lucrative weapon investments. In contrast to the Vietnam War era, there is hardly a protest against our endless wars from mainstream religious bodies. These are the educated and progressive people in our society, and they are mostly silent. Jeff's question number 8. You have invested a lot of your academic career in 18th and 19th century French philosopher and utopian Charles Fourier, born 1772, died 1837. I must agree, after reading your monograph, Fourier and Agriculture, I can appreciate why you have done so. He was clearly visionary and, for the lack of a better term, way ahead of his time. He is considered one of the early proponents of socialism, but you commented that both Marxists and capitalists hate him, which seems to be a strange juxtaposition. I asked my wife about him. She's French. She went to school in France all her life and never heard of him, yet French students are taught about a whole panoply of philosophers. It would appear that he is not appreciated in his own country either. Yet he seems to have been Promethean in his body of work. Why is such an incredible and productive visionary so obscure? Joan's answer number 8. Capitalists don't like Fourier, and by the way, audio-visual fans out there, it's F-O-U-R-I-E-R. F-O-U-R-I-E-R, if you'd like to look him up, Charles Fourier. Because he had such a fine, detailed, and often funny critique of the free enterprise system. Marxists, with few exceptions, don't want to validate his insights for several reasons. A, he and his disciple, Victor Considerant, and I'll spell that for you, C-O-N-S-I-D-E-R-A-N-T. When I see French words, I have a tendency to pronounce them in French. Victor Considerant were the source of ideas, even phrases that later appeared in the Communist Manifesto. Marxists don't want too much exploration of this. Engels, in his later years, did pay some compliments to Fourier. B. Fourier did not regard class struggle as an agent of history or the proletariat as a revolutionary class. His socialism would be promoted by intellectuals of all classes and would benefit even the affluent. Fourier was also opposed to violence and deplored the French Revolution. He is associated with, quote, utopianism, end of quote, and retrograde petty bourgeois localism or agrarianism. At best, he, and more especially Considerant, were purveyors of social democracy or, quote, New Deal liberalism, end of quote, regarded as impediments to socialism by Marxists. C. While Fourier had many brilliant ideas, he also had some that were not respectable, such as abolition of marriage and sexual freedom, often orchestrated for all non-violent tastes. However, Fourier excluded children from this aspect of his future communal society. He had some strong prejudices. He disdained Jews because of his perception of their business practices, and Chinese for their oppression of women. Finally, and fatally, he had weird notions, example, that humans would grow tails. Yet he wasn't all that crazy with his predictions on global warming. It is quite common for critics of capitalism to be thrown out with the bathwater because their prejudices are not respectable. The defenders rarely, example, Henry Ford. Nevertheless, as a graduate student, I thought that a concentration on Fourier would doom me as a nut. Really? I was a socialist. That was bad enough, and I had little luck in finding suitable academic employment. So much for academic freedom. My favorite G.B. Shaw quote, if you are protesting high heels, be sure to wear a smart hat. I didn't know that. George Bernard Shaw. If you are protesting high heels, be sure to wear a smart hat. I'm sorry, it's not small, smart. I'm glad I reread that. Jeff's question number 9. I love his quote that civilization has been preceded by 3 stages: savagery, patriarchat, or patriarchy, and barbarism. Extant, still ongoing. He then proposes a utopian era named harmony, which would last for 70,000 years. That sounds remarkably similar to ancient China's Datong, D-A-T-O-N-G, which is essentially communism where no one is in want or need. Society is in ideal balance or harmony, and where crime and war no longer exist. I understand that Chinese philosophy was all the rage in Europe until about 1680. In all your research on Fourier, was he smitten and or influenced by Confucius, Lao Tzu, and Buddha? Joan's answer to number 9. Fourier considered Buddhism too austere. His utopia was to be based on food, music, sex, and flowers. Not a bad combination. No suffering permitted. Well, there goes Taoism. He also maintained that, quote, the best countries have always been those which allowed women the most freedom, end of quote. Wow. Variants of this are what Fourier has been praised for even by Marxists. He was the most feminist of socialists. He thought China was among the nations in which women were most subjugated. Jeff's question number 10. Fourier wrote about eliminating the, quote, 12 classes of parasites, end of quote. I assume we still suffer their existence. Who are they? Joan's answer number 10. The 12 classes of parasites are domestic parasites. 1, women. 2, children. 3, servants. Social parasites. 4, armies. 5, fiscal agents. 6, manufacturers. 7, commerce. 8, transportation. And accessory parasites. Number 9, the unemployed. Number 10, sophists. Number 11, idlers. And number 12, dropouts. There's a lot of room for discussion there. Interesting. Jeff's question number 11. You wrote about the USA's 19th century communitarian and associationism movement in Fourier and agriculture. There were 29 Fourierist phalanxes, or groups. In other words, a phalanx or a group, founded mostly in the U.S., Midwest, and New England. You mentioned the Shakers and Oneida community, the latter lasting for 32 years. This was a movement to solve the major political, social, and economic problems of the time, including race, sex, and class inequality. They seemed to offer so much hope and set an example for many of us. Why didn't they last and catch on more widely? Going back to pre-liberation China, the CPC-PLA succeeded with their self-reliance. Soviets, is that what it takes to keep the flames of idealism burning? An overarching ideology and vanguard party like communism, socialism? Joan's answer number 11, communitarianism. There were several reasons for their demise. One was the development of mass production, which made their craft system less competitive and required assembly lines in huge factories near urban workers. Socialist energies moved to the trade union movement and Marxist approaches. Today, it would be easier to localize production. The children of communalism wanted to do something different. The larger capitalist society lured once production picked up in the late 19th century. So, for example, few men joined the Shakers because of their celibacy policy also, and the orphans bailed out at the age of 18. Field work and carpentry could be done only by men, according to their theory, and the sisters had to hire outsiders to maintain their, quote, self-sufficient, end of quote, community. Overarching ideology and indoctrination helped a lot. Yet even this faded, especially with the progress of science. The Hutterites, Hutterites, the most long-lived of the early communitarian societies, are now facing decline in part because of the introduction of cell phones and the internet. A similar weakening effect occurred in East European socialist countries. The children wanted to do something different. They didn't remember why their parents and grandparents chose socialism. Many hadn't, but conformed as a practical matter. People were lured by the outside capitalist systems. There was also covert and overt subversion by cold warriors. Socialist indoctrination lost its effect, even among leaders, and crucially among scientists and intellectuals. A useful anthology exploring this process is called Communism Unwrapped by Paulina Bren, B-R-E-N, and Mary Neuberger, N-E-U-B-U-R-G-E-R. It appears to be a book. Communal living has so many advantages, especially in our day with the decline of the family, but isn't popular. I have asked experts on Soviet housing without much useful response why the, quote, the state of the art, end of quote, communal housing built in Moscow in the late 1960s was canceled. An extremely well-equipped communal apartment complex, House of the New Life, designed by architect N. Osterman, O-S-T-E-R-M-A-N, and others, was built as a prototype. The residents were to be small families and single people of all occupations and economic status. Some of the residents would be the staff for the building, which included a large dining room, small cafes, and closets on the main floor for overnight disinfection of clothing. Those who didn't want to eat in the communal places could have meals sent up on a dumbwaiter. There was also a clinic, a library, a pool, sports halls, children's playgrounds, hobby workshops, radio and TV studios, et al. However, it was deemed impractical as a model and converted into a university dormitory. Some denounced it as conferring too much privilege on residents. Others deemed it a leftist deviation threatening the institution of the family. And Joan actually includes an architect's bird's eye view of it. It looks pretty interesting, and a hyperlink to learn more about it. So be sure and get to this if you're listening and watching to the China Rising Radio Sinoland page to see it all. There's the residential complex, a House of the New Life, now a dormitory for postgraduate students of Moscow State University. I'm not going to go through it, but she lists all the different parts of what all the numbers on the bird's eye schematic represent. Continuing on with Joan's answer, despite its potential benefits, communal living does not appear to be very attractive anywhere. Why is this? Is it because there are a few examples of the happy family home and more imaginary ones nurtured by literature and television? Is it the memory of primitive conditions in hippie and early Soviet communes? Is the tribe the natural arrangement for humans existing for thousands of years in prehistory? Or is it a form to be transcended according to the progressive view of humanity? Even in 19th century communitarian societies of the United States, there was a tendency for couples to move away from collective provision into individual households, although the members had voluntarily joined as communards. Some critics of Soviet communalism claim that its real purpose was to free women for work in the, quote, productive sector, end of quote, rather than liberating them for self-fulfillment or promoting their equality. Very interesting. Jeff's question number 12. On Counterpunch, you wrote a great article called "What Else is Wrong with Globalization?" I was like 99% of humanity and swallowed the GATT, G-A-T-T, WTO, NAFTA, EU propaganda Kool-Aid. It really has turned out to be at the vanguard of destroying our pale blue dot. Cut flowers shipped from Kenya to the EU in air-conditioned jets. Thailand bringing in huge papayas from hot houses in Holland, which we ate when we lived there for a year. Caribbean countries being forced to sell passports and villas to rich foreigners instead of bananas. There are thousands of similar cases ongoing. This not to mention chemically soaked GMO monoculture agriculture, mono-industrial economies, and modern-day slaves getting paid pennies a day to die young. Yet Mexico just signed a new NAFTA deal with the USA and Canada, even though the first one destroyed much of its centuries-old native economy and culture. Why? Only a handful of countries seem to have thrived under global capitalism's WTO: China, South Korea, Vietnam, and a few others that have exported their way towards broad citizen prosperity. How to stop all this madness? The French voted down the ultra-neoliberal European Treaty twice, only to have its corrupt legislature pass it in the middle of the night over their popular objections. As a result, everything in France is being privatized, and the European Treaty excludes any government ownership or economic planning in the phony, quote, free markets, end of quote. How to end this madness, kill the WTO, and save the human race? Joan's answer number 12. Global capitalism is not irrational or based solely on greed. Governments are trying to make capitalism work with stopgap patches. The banana war ended with the WTO forbidding the EU to have even a tiny quota for bananas from their former Caribbean and African colonies. Tourism, an environmentally destructive industry with much exploited labor, is declining. So what's a country to do? Sell passports and real estate to wealthy people who may never touch down. Grenada lost much of its nutmeg business because of artificial flavoring and fewer eggnog enthusiasts. Panama hats? Ganja is becoming the world's most valuable drug, surpassing coffee. Bermuda shorts? Just kidding. Bermuda was a very nice place. Although a colony, workers had a good standard of living and managerial positions. But tourists thought of it as a place for formal dress and high tea, despite the excellent beaches and snorkeling. So now the major industry is offshore corporate headquarters. It may end because of the chaos, which gets worse when so many nations and businesses want to sell the same stuff to people who already have too much, and resources are rapidly polluted and depleting. In my book, Greening Cities, I opined that a green economy must be primarily local and production based on use, not profits or jobs. Most advocates of the Green New Deal do not agree. There are people in the Chinese leadership who wish for an eco-socialist future, but they may be outnumbered. We hear of a greater focus on consumerism. I am not hopeful. Jeff's question number 13. Joan, what projects do you have in the pipeline? Joan's answer number 13. I could write several books, except that it entails too much sitting on my tail. That's my problem, doing all my writing and stuff. For a long time, I've been trying to discover why NATO has so much support in Western Europe. I have a few answers, but seek more concerning the economic impact. B, there is still much to learn about the ways the nonprofit sector is enmeshed with the military. C, an investigation of the lessons to be had from the experiences of former and existing socialist societies relevant to a realistic socialism for our time. D, on the lighter side, I'm an amateur bookbinder, well, that's cool, and have an unfinished pop-up book illustrating Fourier's quote, the World War of Small Pastries, end of quote. I'll buy a copy. Maybe I will finish it. E, I teach in an academy of lifelong learning, and perhaps next semester I will offer an update of my course on the, quote, politics of food and agriculture. For anyone who can make use of it, there is a, quote, short course, end of quote, 8 sessions on the military-industrial complex on my website, which is in the article at the top. Get to the China Rising Radio Sinoland website and this interview page, suitable for high school, college, and adult education. I really enjoyed reading Joan's answers, and I hope you enjoyed listening to all or watching all the questions and answers. It's been a lovely experience getting to know her, and hopefully my wife and I'll get to meet her one of these days if we ever get back to New Hampshire, or she gets over here to France. This is Jeff J. Brown, China Rising Radio Sinoland, signing out. Bye-bye.